I'm honored and pleased to introduce Dr. Joan Thirsk, recently retired as Reader in Economic History at Oxford and the General Editor of the Agrarian History of England and Wales. It's fair to say, I think, that outside these shores, you're best known as editor and major contributor to the early modern volumes 4 and 5, of the massive Agrarian History of England and Wales. Would you tell me about the inception of that project and your early involvement with it?
Yes, it was Professor Finberg's idea, H.P.R. Finberg's. He was then in charge of the Department of English Local History at Leicester. And I had been working there for some years as a senior research fellow, making a study of the agrarian history of Lincolnshire. And I was coming to the end, and it had proved such an interesting county to study, with very varied farming regions within its bounds. He thought it would be a good idea if we went on to study the whole of England. So he went to see R.H. Tawney, who was regarded as the really outstanding scholar of agrarian history at the time. Tawney had supervised my thesis and asked his views on the subject, and he was very encouraging indeed. So Finberg came back, and that's how the subject was launched.
What was Tawney like as a thesis supervisor?
He was extremely informal, very warm and encouraging. And I was grateful for that, because I felt very immature beginning my research and not quite certain how it was going to emerge. He was very disorderly in his own study, in the way he maintained his papers. And when I look at my study these days, which is almost in similar disorder, I console myself because it was so like Tawney's. But he was most careful to give you every assistance that you asked for. And if you wrote to him or went to see him and he was going to look something up for you, promptly, a day or two later, would come a little postcard. It was a pre-stamped postcard always. He must have had a great pile on his desk with the answer to your questions. He was a very gentle person with me, but he could, of course, be very tough indeed. And I've seen him get very angry with graduate students who he thought were becoming doctrinaire in their statements. But for me, he was a most stimulating person. And of course, while I was carrying the results of my research to him, in our conversations, I learned a great deal about the work that he was doing. And he was engaged on the book on Cranfield at the time. So my mind was constantly being enriched by much deeper investigations that he was doing.
What did you work on with Tawney? What was your thesis?
That was on the sale of royalist estates during the interregnum. It wasn't a subject that I thought up for myself. It was something that he suggested to me among a number of other things that required research. And it happened to be a very happy choice, because I found a lot of material on the whole subject proved most rewarding. And then when I'd come to the end of that and finished my thesis, W.G. Hoskins went to see Tawney, because he was by then editor of the Victoria County History for Leicestershire. He was looking for somebody who would write the chapter on the agrarian history of Leicestershire from 1500 onwards, and Tawney suggested that I do it. So that was how I first came to meet W.G. Hoskins.
Your travels to that position in a sense, had been along a traditional academic path, had been very much interrupted by the Second World War. Your school had been moved out of London, your college moved to Oxford, and then from 1942 to 45, you served in the ATS. Where had 1942, when you joined the ATS, where had that found you in terms of your formal education? What were you reading history?
No, I had been an enthusiastic student of history at school. Let me say that straight away. One of my teachers was a grey-haired lady, Miss Bell, who must have been one of the earliest students at the LSE, because the name of Lillian Knowles became very familiar to me. She had obviously studied under her, and she must have been at the LSE perhaps in the first or second decade of this century. And she taught economic history to us in the way that she had been taught. But that sparked off an exciting interest in the subject. But actually, I was also quite a linguist at school, and when it came to choosing the university course, I chose to study modern languages. So I went to Westfield College to do this, and German was my first language, and French was my second, and I was also studying Spanish out of interest. Then at the end of that first year, that was 1942, we were told that we must go and do war work, or else if we stayed on, I think we had to promise to teach. And I decided that I would go and do war work. And so I went into the ATS at that point, and I went into the intelligence corps because I had German. So that's where 1942 found me.
Yes, where were you serving in the intelligence corps, and what were you doing?
I went to Bletchley. I was involved with the deciphering of signals traffic. A great deal of publicity has been given in recent years to the work that was done at Bletchley. I was not one of the people who actually translated the messages that came through. Only one woman was a translator among a very large group of men. But I was one of the people who analysed the signals traffic. But in being at Bletchley, I had a lot of time to read, and I did read a lot of history. I read a lot of R.H. Tawney in particular. I think that he probably interested me most of all. And then I married in 1945. If I had been going on to be a really good linguist, I would have wanted to go to Germany and become absolutely fluent in the language. And that certainly didn't seem possible in 1945, and I couldn't really go off and leave my husband in England. So I decided to change and read history instead. So at Westfield, they very decently accepted me as a historian, and I did my first degree in 2 years.
Westfield was a women's college of the University of London. And when you moved back to Oxford in 1965 as reader in economic history, you were elected Fellow of St. Hilda's, still a women's college. I simply invite your comment on the role of women's colleges in general.
Yes, those choices were to some extent accidental. I wasn't deliberately choosing women's colleges, but when I first applied for university places, it was to Oxford, Cambridge and London that one automatically applied. So in Oxford and Cambridge, that meant women's colleges at that time. There was no choice. I did get a place at Somerville, but it was only a place, and in those days that didn't mean that any fees were paid, so I couldn't afford to take that up.
Would you comment on the role of, and diminishing role of women's colleges in the education of women?
Oh yes, I'm very strongly in favour of maintaining a varied choice for all students, really, but certainly for women. I think that some women flourish much better in an all-women's college, and I think that I did. I don't think I would have done quite so well had I gone to a mixed college, but because I was a rather diffident sort of person when I was young. When I went to St Hilda's, again, it was an accident. Well, I had no invitation at that time because there were no mixed colleges in Oxford. Yes. I was invited by women's colleges in Oxford to become a fellow. But after that, I became increasingly convinced that it was necessary to preserve women's colleges as an alternative to mixed colleges. After all, I had been in a mixed university in Leicester and a mixed college at the London School of Economics. I wasn't opposed to them in any sense, but I thought it was desirable to preserve some. And I certainly, while I was at St Hilda's, fought very strongly to preserve it as a women's college.
You mentioned your marriage in 1945 a few moments ago. You have two children.
Yes.
A son, I believe, born in 1956, a daughter born in 1958.
That's right, yes.
While you were at Leicester.
Yes.
Anyone looking at your list of publications and at your early services to economic and agrarian history, where you joined the executive committee of the British Agricultural History Society only 2 years after your arrival at Leicester, that you joined the council of the Economic History Society 2 years after that, for instance. Anyone looking just at that would never be able to infer your children's birth dates. How did you and your family manage this?
Well, I certainly didn't neglect my children.
This wasn't the suggestion.
As I explained, I had light teaching duties at Leicester, and that's what made it possible. I only taught at Leicester for 2 terms out of 3. So if you look in detail at the dates of birth of those children, you will find that one was born in August, one was born in September, and I didn't have to start teaching again at Leicester until January.
So you had more flexibility than you might have because of the post. Did you have any help in child raising?
Yes, we had a children's nurse living in the house for 5.5 years, yes. But I pulled my weight. I didn't feel that she was the only one in charge of my children. I did do an enormous amount with my children. I was always on duty at night. I did feel that she deserved a quiet night's sleep. I mean, I wasn't in a position to apply for a great many jobs that I would have liked to have applied for if I had been totally free. By the time I had gone to Oxford, my children were older. And when I went, my husband rather hoped that he would be able to find a job in Oxford. After all, it's packed full of libraries, and he's a public librarian. But it soon became clear that no job in librarianship would appear there because the librarians are very low, the working librarians, I should say, are very lowly creatures in Oxford. And he was a chief librarian of a London borough. So we had to give up that idea, and I had to travel to Oxford. But after all, the terms are comparatively short in Oxford.
Despite the explanation you've given, I defy anyone to look at the list of publications and services, and find any gap.
Well, I think you learn in these circumstances to use your time most efficiently.
Yes,
it's perfectly true. It's something that is so natural to me now that I never comfortably sit still doing nothing. I'm always busy with something, and I do positively feel quite uneasy if I'm sitting still doing nothing.
Now, although the timing is somewhat different, I'm hardly the first to have noticed that in academic life in general, and in economic history in particular, there were more prominent women in earlier generations. Eileen Power, Alice Clark, Caris Wilson, Marshall, than in a later generation. Have you puzzled over this yourself?
I think that very often when new enterprises start, when new branches of study open up in this particular instance, the women are very prominent indeed. And they are very original in many of their ideas. They come to the fore in this way. They are also very good at handling the detailed chores that are necessary when something new is starting up. And so in many different examples, I have seen women prominent in the first stages of a development. Then it becomes successful and it expands, and then the women get edged out. And I have seen this happen so often that I now regard it as a general rule of life. It's very obvious in the beginnings of economic history, as you say, with the people that you cite at the London School of Economics, and there is actually a longer list of women if one investigates. Yes. It's true at the beginning of the Economic History Society, and Julia Mann was one of the people who has talked about this, because she was the right-hand woman of Lipson. Mm-hmm. She was his assistant editor. It was true with the founding of the Agricultural History Society. I regard it as a general rule.
Most of your own publications, those that appeared in print so apparently seamlessly, many of them have been concerned with agrarian history and have indeed helped to define the field for modern scholars. But you've also written on topics different from agriculture. You've your book, Economic Policy and Projects, on the development of consumer society in England, published in 1978, and earlier you wrote articles on the history of the family, on inheritance. Sometimes I sense that your writing was inspired by the work of the scholar being honored in the Festschrift to which you were contributing.
It didn't really happen like that. All these subjects have grown out of work that I was doing in some branch of agrarian history. In the case of the essay that I wrote for the Tawney Festschrift, that was not really inspired by Tawney's work, but by the fact that I was working on the agrarian history 1500 to 1640 for volume 4, and I began to see this pattern of rural industries in certain parts of England and not in others, and I began to recognize the agricultural regimes with which the industries seemed to match. And I was just waiting for an opportunity to write it up. Oh. So when I was invited to write for the Tawney Festschrift, I chose that subject. In fact, at the time, it was a most difficult piece of work. I almost made myself ill writing it. It seemed so hard. And yet I knew that it was an important article, that I had really discovered something that was quite significant. And I felt a great sense of achievement when I actually emerged at the other end, having completed it. But then I went on to take more interest in other rural industries that turned up, like the stocking knitting industry, which no one really had paid much attention to before. And so I was already known to be working on stocking knitting, and I'd been encouraged by the Passold Trust to get on with this and write it up.
You list machine knitting as a hobby of yours in framework knitting?
Yes, it's certainly like framework
in your
knitting.
Entry in Who's Who.
Yes, I'm really quite addicted to machine knitting. And that started quite accidentally when I was in Oxford and happened to see a second-hand machine for sale in a newspaper shop next door to the hairdresser that I was visiting. And I knew absolutely nothing about machine knitting at the time. And I just bought the machine. And I went to classes in Oxford. And as I say, I do a great deal of this in my spare time now. But that was a very instructive experience, and in a way it fertilized my understanding of the knitting industry, its history, because I was attending classes which were attended by a very varied cross-section of people, mostly women, but not entirely. And they were all beginners, but they came from all ranks of society, and I realized then that if you once offer a technology to people, you cannot prevent them from experimenting in every sort of way. And all
you
of
saw
us,
that all around you.
Yes, so that when I look at the variety of cloths that we call the new draperies, these light cloths that were being made in Western Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. I know exactly why they were so varied, because you just cannot prevent people from following their artistic ideas.
You mentioned a few moments ago the article you wrote for the Tawny Festschrift, Industries in the Countryside. Interestingly, I think, in some circles, this article has been even more cited than your work on agrarian history, or more agriculturally oriented agrarian history. You set that article most precisely in the 16th and very early 17th centuries. And it seemed to me that your careful description and analysis of dual-employed households has sometimes been carelessly appropriated, misappropriated, taken up without sufficient care to the context with which you had so well placed it. And this has been done especially by some recent investigators of rural industry, of proto-industry. Would you care to comment on that?
Yes, it's perfectly true that my article has been grossly simplified sometimes. I found people saying that I said that industries sprang up wherever portable inheritance was practiced, for example. Whereas I saw industries growing up in circumstances where a whole web of different factors operated.
I'd like to move on, if we could, to the state of economic history and the development of economic history, and invite your assessment of the new economic history, for example.
Well, for me it's rather a sad story. because I think that the subject is being channeled into a rather narrow pathway, where before it was a broad highway, attracting scholars who were encouraged to investigate a very broad range of problems. I'm rather melancholy about the present state because I think it is extinguishing interest in the subject, in the path it's taking, and I think of how exciting a subject it was when the Economic History Review was first set up, and how exciting it was when I was taught economic history, and it ranged over a much broader field.
You blame this on the new economic history?
Yes, I do. I'm perfectly prepared to accept all that the new economic historians write, because they are tackling important branches of the subject. But then they are closing the entrances to many other fields.
This is because the quantitative method limits the range of questions that can be approached.
It does seem to, and I must say that my own insights, where I have thought they were original, have not come from any quantitative investigation of the subject. And very often I find myself examining new developments which couldn't possibly be quantified. And if I had been focusing my attention on materials that would allow me to count, I would simply have missed these points. I think a good illustration is the development of horticulture in the later 16th and 17th centuries. I have seen economists writing about horticulture as a trifling sideline to be ignored in any study of agriculture. And I must say, when I first started to study agriculture in the 16th century, I was inclined to give short shrift to the chapters in books of husbandry of the 16th century concerned with vegetables and orchards. And it was only very gradually that I came to realize how important these branches of agriculture became in the course of the 17th century. There were not many gardeners around, and certainly not many market gardeners around, and you couldn't possibly have quantified the contribution they were making to English diet. But this was the beginning of a very important development that flowered in the 17th century, I think faded somewhat in the 18th, and returned again in the later 19th century. And look what a marvellous flowering of horticulture we're seeing these days.
If agrarian history was born out of a concern, as you've written in an article that I mentioned before of yours, if agrarian history was born out of a concern with the plight of agriculture during the Great Depression of the 19th century, only to be reborn after 1945, are there any signposts now as to where economic history and agrarian history might be going?
But as regards possible developments in agrarian history, I myself am writing a book on alternative agriculture, because I see very strong analogies between the present concerns to find an alternative agriculture and phases in the past when we have been having to search for an alternative agriculture.
Are these parallels in terms of the techniques themselves or in terms of the difficulty of changing from one technique to another?
It's not so much technique, it's the fact that we have to find new things to grow on the land because we're suffering from a surplus of grain and dairy produce and meat, and we are having to look for alternative crops. This is exactly what farmers were doing in the second half of the 17th century when they had more grain than they needed and were looking for alternative crops. And it's quite startling to me to see how often present-day choices are returning to the crops that were grown in the 17th century. You take rapeseed, for example, that was an alternative crop in the late 16th century, and it's a very satisfactory, at the moment, very satisfactory alternative crop at the present. There are lots more like this. I can almost predict where farmers
which ones
are going
there will be
to find the next alternative crop from what I know of the 17th century. But it may well be that agrarian historians will move off in a quite different direction. I think it's very difficult to predict.
Yes.
And I think where we are deficient in our understanding and knowledge at the moment is in our studies of the social composition of the rural community. After all, the agrarian history, to a very large extent, has concentrated on the agrarian regimes. It has said something about society, rural society, but there's a great more to be learned about local differences between regions. And because social history is an expanding subject now, I think it's perfectly possible that agrarian historians will turn their attention increasingly to the social organisation of rural life.
You're now president of the British Association of Local History. What role do you believe local history will have in this move?
I think it's a very important component of history as a whole. And I've always been very keen to promote a partnership between amateur historians who find local history very satisfying and professional historians who need the knowledge of local historians very often to enable them to get absolutely accurate views of their subjects. But for me, local history has also been a very satisfying branch of research. When I have moved sometimes from large topics to studying small ones in a small location, it's been like a refreshing spell, a refreshing sabbatical, really, away from the large generalizations. And I find it necessary to move periodically from the large scene to the intimate, smaller scene in order to get fresh ideas and to get new perspectives on my subject.
What are you working on now?
Well, I hope to write this book on alternative agriculture, which will give a perspective on past and present. When I finish that, I hope to write a history of European horticulture, because work on Volume 5 of the Agrarian History showed how important it became in the economy during the 17th century. And I want to trace all the influences in English horticulture which came from the countries of Western Europe. And I realize that most of our horticultural improvements in Europe have come from Arabic countries. Right. So it is a very long story. and it needs to be told on at least a European scale. So that's the next large project, probably the only one I shall be able to complete.
Oh, my. We all look forward to reading that. Thank you very much for this talk.